I don't think all people who are in this country without permanent resident status should be removed.
Set a federal minimum wage that everybody has to adhere to so that people aren't exploited.
Kind of American idealism that has made our country, invincible.
Whoa, enough is enough. We can't absorb all these people.
Welcome to Our National Conversation, a podcast in which we discuss politics from all angles. We are completely nonpartisan, and all views, respectfully stated, are welcome here. Our podcast is unique in that it is hosted and run by students who are focused on finding solutions to the biggest problems facing America.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to Our National Conversation. My name is Sam Taylor. I'm the COO at ONC, the nonprofit associated with this podcast. The date today is April 19th, and we're going to be discussing immigration. I have two guests with me today. We have some differing perspectives on this subject. It'll be interesting to dig into as we really try to understand where one another's coming from here. Jeff, I think right now let's start with you, if that's all right. For anyone who doesn't know, Jeff Hall is our CEO at ONC, you currently reside in the LA area. And California certainly has the largest number of just undocumented immigrants in the country for a single state. Maybe that's partially owing to just how big California is. But have you had any firsthand experiences with this subject? And what's your general approach to talking about immigration, talking about undocumented immigration, things like that?
I would say anybody who lives in LA or California has had firsthand experience with this. When you really open your eyes, we have a lot of immigrants who work in the restaurants, they do the construction work, they pick the fruit, they're domestic helpers, they clean the homes. I mean, just everywhere you look, we have people who are speaking Spanish, and I think there's kind of an unstated don't ask, don't tell policy. I don't know who all these people are or where they're from, and I generally don't ask. I don't really want to know. I don't want to be accused of hiring somebody illegally. Many of them will often say they do have papers, even though you kind of suspect that maybe they really don't. But in LA, I think if we ever sent all of the undocumented workers home to wherever they come from, and a lot come from Central America also, I think the city would close down. They just do so much work that we need to get done. I think they're good for the economy, and I think most Americans don't want to do the kind of work that the undocumented workers do, especially in the farm areas, which, by the way, is Trump country. You drive up through the Central Valley, there are Trump signs everywhere. When you look at the TV analysis of who's voting for whom, that's Trump country. I don't know how they're going to survive if we send all of the undocumented workers home. I mean, there are programs that people talk about, but they're not really followed through on. For example, there's something called E-Verify, and employers are supposed to check people's records first before hiring them. They generally don't do it. I think only 15% of employers do it. And the reason for that is because they need the workers. If they couldn't hire these people, they'd have to shut down. So I think the last couple of years under the Biden administration, it was a mess. Watching every night on TV as these people poured over the border, I didn't understand it. I thought it was going to be bad for the Democrats. It was. But I am not anti-immigrant. I think they're very important, and they serve a real purpose here in California.
Thank you for that, Jeff. Let's kind of go to Eric next to get your reaction to what Jeff said there, and any other points you want to make on this subject. Eric, for anyone who doesn't know, he's a frequent podcast guest here, and he's one of our writers at ONC, writes various opinion pieces, policy proposals that are published on our website. So, Eric, what are your thoughts?
Sure. So I think when we're talking about immigration, we tend to mesh 2 points together that are really quite separate. So there's the issue of what we do at the border now, which I think Trump has addressed quite well. And then there's the issue of what we do with those who have already crossed over. So in terms of first principles, I think a country must have almost like a membrane, right? Where it can vet those that come in, those that go out, those that come here for reasons of permanent status should meet a higher bar of expectation than for those who are here traveling. Of course. When it comes to like some of the roundups that we may be getting into and some of the the ways to deal with the migrants currently here, that is a little more complicated issue. And I think it's going, if they're smart, the current administration will do something of a tiered rollout, which I think we're already kind of starting to see. So I think if you're convicted of a felony or even specific misdemeanors, I think you should be quickly deported and removed from the country. I don't think there's any right for you to be here. First of all, I want to establish that. But I do think, kind of playing along to what Jeff said, a lot of these people are productive and a lot of these people are frankly necessary. Um, I don't know, maybe in Los Angeles you wouldn't be able to find people to do some of these jobs, but where I live, I imagine that you could. So to me, that's a little bit besides the point. But I think more generally, I don't think all people who are in this country without permanent resident status should be removed because I think a lot of them are key parts of the economy. And if they're here, if they just want to have a better life for their family, I think they should be allowed to stay, especially if they're, contributing to the economic workforce, which, and maybe we don't spend too much time on this, but virtually every country in the West has a population problem. Our populations are not yet shrinking, but a lot of estimates think that they will be soon. If you want to take a look at South Korea, some of those metrics are really, really discouraging. So I think, if they're abiding by our laws, if they have the desire that I think most Americans have to have a free and prosperous life, then they should be allowed to stay. The specific implementations of that, I think, can get kind of tricky. Um, but I think if you're diligent and you take your time with it and you do a tiered rollout, I think you could come up with a possible solution.
Mhm. And just to clarify, when you say tiered rollout,
Yeah.
is this kind of a okay? Um, we deport people who are convicted of violent felonies, things like that. First of all, and then we start deporting other groups of people, or we address other groups of people with a different sort of policy. What sort? I suppose what is rolled out in these various sections of a tiered system here?
Sure. So I think you can describe generally traits to which that we want people to have who are going to stay, and those which we're not so favorable towards. So, for example, tier one, as I said, are people who are either dangerous or have been convicted of a crime. Tier two might be, okay, are you working? Are you adding actively to our society in terms of, I don't just look at people as labor, but a lot of our financial statistics do. So if you're contributing in that way, do you have a family? How long have you been here? All of these are factors as to how you might differentiate between different peoples. Um, I can't say that I've drawn up a perfect plan, and I think you could have a whole debate on the aspects of those phases, even if you need two or three phases after the first. I don't know what that exactly looks like, but I think you could rank just like you would with how you're sorting through immigration documents if a person applies to come here. There's certain things that we would prefer you to believe in, or prefer traits that you possess. For example, if you have a skill, um, there was a controversy recently with some of the H1B visas. If you have a competent skill and you're not just um, physical labor, then you might have precedent over some other people, or excuse me, priority. So that's kind of where I fall on that.
I think that's just practical what Eric just said. I think, a lot of the critics of the Trump administration right now are saying it ought to be a lot more scalpel and a lot less machete or chainsaw. And I think the same idea applies to immigration. Somebody ought to put together the numbers and say to ourselves, how many computer programmers do we need? How many domestic servants do we need? How many people do we need working in um, aging facilities where people are in assisted living here in Los Angeles and in the rest of California? We have a lot of Filipinos who do that kind of work. How many gardeners do we need? How many fruit pickers do we need? And then let that number of people in, every year, maybe only on a temporary basis, and then at the end of the picking season they have to go home again. There's got to be a more rational way to figure this out rather than to scare the bejesus out of everybody. I mean, even if you're an American now, some people fear that the Trump people could round you up and send you off to El Salvador to rot away in prison. That doesn't feel like America to me.
Hmm. Yeah, certainly there's a lot of issues with the implementation of deportation policy right now. I mean, the the rhetoric and the idea seems to be, okay, we're going to at least start with deporting people who are, a threat to public safety, who are violent criminals, etc. But then you have, like, just recently, there was a PhD student here at BYU who was detained, and his student visa was initially revoked, and there were threats of deportation because a few years back he got a fishing citation. Um, so there's just a lot that is kind of missed in the bureaucracy, or through a really heavy-handed approach to this issue, just upends people's lives unnecessarily. Um, but I guess maybe it seems to me that we're kind of in agreement that maybe we need a more careful policy here. Maybe we need, a tiered kind of rollout of some sort of well thought out, policy to address this issue. But there's an area of potential disagreement I'm seeing here, and that's on the effects of undocumented immigrants on our workforce, and whether they're taking jobs from Americans or taking jobs that Americans would want to fill if that space is made available. Jeff, you had said that this doesn't really seem to be the case in your experience, either in the LA area or even in rural Californian areas, which are very different from the kind of urban segment there. And Eric, I believe you had said that you think in other areas of the country this isn't true. That Americans would be willing to fill these spots. So I'm just curious if there is a disagreement here, and if so, what's kind of motivating it? What are either of you seeing that's leading you to believe one thing on this issue? Eric, let's start with you just to see if you did disagree with Jeff on this point.
Yeah, I do. I think I do. I think there's a few issues I have with using a almost permanent class of temporary status holders for work. Number one is wages. So, you know, I've had a lot of people in my family who are contractors, and you can always find cheap, um, probably illegal immigrant labor, um, and you would go to that first. And some of them are quite handy. This is what they do for a living. If you go to Home Depot down here, now recently this has been lessened, but you could go to Home Depot with your truck. You can communicate to them if you can speak Spanish, and you can say, I have a day's work for you for X amount for an hour. And that rate is consistently lower than what you would pay a normal citizen. So I think there's a little bit of wage shifting going on there that I don't think is beneficial for everyone involved. And I think a path to their citizenship, if they're truly contributing, would be the way to go about that.
Eric, I just want to clarify. You keep saying here. Where do you live?
Yeah, sure. Sorry about that. I live currently in Slidell, which is a town just north of New Orleans.
Okay, very good. And Sam, you're in Utah.
Hmm.
Okay.
Yeah, Jeff, I guess what's your reaction to what Eric said there? Because I mean, I guess my initial thought is that, it seems to me there are lots of experts saying, okay, these jobs, just aren't something that most Americans are willing to do. There's not really a market for these sorts of positions. People often use the term backbreaking labor. And undocumented immigrants are willing to fill that. Eric makes an interesting point that there's, a big difference in the wages. And maybe if wages were higher, because we didn't have so many undocumented immigrants, that Americans would be more willing to fill these positions. So I don't know, just kind of what's your reaction there? And then I might be able to delve into some more of my thoughts.
I don't know. I think with construction, Eric has a point, but do we even have enough construction workers? We have a very low unemployment rate right now nationally. It's like around 4%, I believe. And I keep reading that people who run construction companies, like especially here in Los Angeles, where we have a constant housing shortage, which has only been exacerbated in a huge way by the Palisades fire, which wiped out thousands of housing units. Same with the Eaton fire. We need workers to help rebuild. And I don't think there are enough Americans to do this kind of work. So um, I think we have to be open minded here.
Hmm. Yeah, Eric, we'll go back to you, but if I could add one other thing here that I'm just curious, kind of, how you might grapple with or address. You said that this wage issue. is kind of bad for everyone involved, right? Because the undocumented immigrants are getting less than maybe what they should, and Americans also aren't able to fill positions that they otherwise would. Um, but I mean, just one reaction I have to that is, at the very least, this seems to be better than what these undocumented immigrants would be getting, say, in their home countries, or wherever they're coming from. I mean, there's a reason why they're coming to America and pursuing this work, even at these lower wages. So in terms of just, I guess, an analysis of deporting them or not letting them in versus letting them take these jobs, even if they're lower wages, it still seems to be an improvement in a situation, a sort of progress towards a better life. And so might not be such a, I don't know, a bad thing for the individuals engaging in these jobs. So I guess there's kind of 2 points there that I'm just curious, because I really want to understand your perspective here, how you might address. The first, maybe these wages are a relative boon for the undocumented immigrants, and second, as Jeff mentioned, maybe because unemployment rates among U.S. citizens are so low, and because we really need a greater workforce in construction and so forth, that the sort of taking jobs Americans would otherwise fill is sort of a non-issue. Just what's your reaction to both of those things?
Sure. So, I think there's almost no doubt that some of the wages that you're getting paid, especially, in the American dollar, are going to be more favorable for some of these workers. But that's really a secondary principle to mine, because my primary concern lies with the American citizen and their workforce. And I think what Jeff is saying is true, especially when you're dealing with something like a natural disaster, like the city of Los Angeles just dealt with. I think you can make exceptions, to deal with that kind of issue. But my main priority is, if we're going to allow these people to cross the border, like Jeff said, and maybe go back and forth, or if we're going to allow them to stay here permanently, then we need to know who they are. We need to be able to vet them. So, and that is really my most pressing concern. And maybe the unwillingness to do some of this work speaks to the standards of the work, but it also could speak to, more generally, a cultural malaise a lot of Americans had. Maybe this is more a conservative talking point, but I think we push far too many people into college and put them into debt, and set their expectations for a life that they don't necessarily need. I see a lot of people that I was friends with in high school just go into trades, and do things outside of the collegiate realm. Now, we are a more educated country, so therefore we should have more people in college and aspiring. Um, to be able to do things within, kind of more service sectors rather than, manufacturing or physical labor. But I do see kind of like a cultural rejection of those kind of jobs, as if they're less than. And I don't think that's true. So, maybe that's an impossible problem for us to solve here. But I think that has something to do with it. And I think, like I said, it depends on where you are. I think you could find people to do some of these jobs. Quicker than a lot of people think.
Actually, let me jump in here. We have a mentor who works with our students from time to time. His name is Ruben Navarrete, and he studies Gen Z, as do I actually. Through osmosis here, hanging out with you guys, I've learned a lot about your generation. But he had an electrician in his house a few months ago who was working on something, and they started talking about Gen Z, and this electrician said he can't hire members of Gen Z who really, you're right, not all members of Gen Z should go to college. Uh, Trades pay very well. This guy said he was offering $100,000 to early workers just getting started. He still couldn't find anybody. He said a lot of these Gen Z kids don't want the work because they feel it's beneath their dignity. So there's something wrong there.
Oh, absolutely. I mean, my dad is an elevator technician, so he went to trade school. He did all of that, and I mean, it's work that's, I feel like people have this conception that it's like, okay, if you engage in work like that, it's not intellectually stimulating or whatever else, or, as you said, Jeff, it's just kind of beneath their dignity. But I mean, he really has to know his stuff in terms of like, working with electrical components, understanding the mechanisms and the engineering behind elevators, escalators, and so forth. Like this isn't something that's just, manual labor and nothing else. And even if it was, I mean, that's still a incredibly valuable and necessary element of our workforce. I just feel like there are so many misconceptions about
Definitely.
these positions.
You know, if you go to college or graduate school, when you step onto that elevator, you want to know for sure it's going to work okay. You don't
Oh
want to
yeah.
get you don't want to get up to the 17th floor and suddenly have it drop.
Hmm.
We need our tradespeople and we need them to be good.
Hmm. Yeah, yeah, no, absolutely. Full agreement there. I think let's maybe get back to something that I thought was really interesting, and that is this, I guess, difference between different locations in terms of their labor needs, and how those might be filled by immigrant populations or populations of people who are already American citizens. Obviously, in LA and even rural areas around LA, it seems that undocumented immigrants provide a necessary boon. Um, but Eric, you have this suspicion that in other areas the situation might be fairly different. I'm curious, is there some sort of, I guess, local policy? Because immigration, it seems very, very national, at this time. Is there some sort of local policy reform we can adopt where different areas can set priorities for immigration, that meet their labor needs, that meet the needs of the community? What might something like that look like? We're just kind of brainstorming here. We're not policy experts per se. I'm just curious as to whether this is an area where we might have some bipartisan overlap, where we can kind of address the concerns levied by MAGA Republicans, other conservatives, while still affording immigrants and undocumented immigrants opportunities towards work, towards citizenship, just depending on the needs of any given community. What are our thoughts there?
Sure. So I think this is a really interesting topic, because I think a lot of people on the conservative side of the ledger are dying for a return to federalism. Now, the Constitution gives the president authority over immigration, but I think we kind of saw Biden kind of concede a lot of that authority. Now, you can look at that two ways. You could say he was using his authority to open up the border, or he was just completely foregoing it. Um, but it's an interesting question because in capitalism, a lot of people on my side of the ledger tend to kind of worship that word, but it can produce a lot of negative externalities. If you are in a small town and you can pay an undocumented migrant less, even though you really don't need to, you could afford to do the extra $3 or $4 an hour that you would need to hire an American citizen. You're going to go with the option that pays less, especially if the quality of the work is comparable. But I think that's an interesting point. If you were willing to have some kind of negotiation between the executive branches in some of the states, saying like a state like my state, like Louisiana, like we need people, um, but I think we have a pretty trained workforce for some of the industries that we need to fill. But that's going to be a state by state basis. So I think there is some room there, maybe for some negotiation. Now, no branch wants to give up their power, especially not Trump. I don't ever see a future in which he relinquishes his immigration power back to the states. But I imagine there could be some negotiation there.
I'm going to speak like a capitalist for a moment. Having lower wage workers in our workforce helps keep the cost of everything down. Other American workers will have to remain competitive in the marketplace. So if there are less expensive immigrant workers, well, they have to, be mindful of that before they overprice themselves. Now, on the other hand, I feel sorry for people who are working at minimum wage. I think the federal minimum wage is like $7.50. Nobody pays that anymore. You have to pay more to attract a workforce. I think to work even in a fast food place now in LA, it's up over $20. So maybe the remedy here is to set a federal minimum wage that everybody has to adhere to, so that people aren't exploited.
Yeah, what's your reaction to a policy like that, Eric? To try to address, both the potential exploitation of undocumented immigrants and, ensuring that I guess Americans have access to wages in these jobs, should they want to pursue them, that meets their needs, because I mean, minimum wage, it's certainly in terms of the connotation around the term something that is on the progressive end of the spectrum, and maybe kind of elicits a guttural reaction from right-wing individuals. So I don't know, what's your reaction to something like that?
Sure. So we discussed earlier that the people coming from some of these countries, the wages that we would pay them are far lower or far higher than what they would receive back in their home countries and have far more purchasing power. And I think, as the government of the United States, I think we have a priority to our people. So while I do think some of Jeff's arguments are valid, I think bringing in a class of people who expect less from their government is unfair to the average American worker. That being said, I also would like to push back against this idea of a federally mandated minimum wage. I think that's a good thing for states to work out on their own. And kind of going back to this idea of to each state its own needs and its own solutions. I think kind of their policies around immigration status, could be kind of determined by themselves. We kind of saw this with sanctuary cities. It was freedom in the other direction, right? The federal government wasn't banging down the doors of sanctuary cities saying you have to do something about these migrants. Maybe we could see something like that where we give states the freedom to choose. Of course, there's a federally set minimum wage, and states can do with that what they will. But even going as to how many immigrants they want to allow, in what capacity, in what status. So I think that's a better solution than a federally mandated higher minimum wage.
Yeah, Jeff, is that kind of what you were envisioning? Something that's more local, state-based, or something that is just kind of a blanket national implementation?
I can't claim that I envisioned anything. I just kind of made that up on the spot. But I'd be open to the idea of local states having more control over their local economy. I mean, in Louisiana, I'm guessing you pay lower wages than we do here in California.
Mm,
Certainly.
mm.
I mean, the cost of living in California is exorbitant, especially when it comes to housing, which is another reason you might want some of this less expensive labor to help build housing because it'll keep the price of housing lower than it otherwise might. If you say, only American workers can build housing, I think you remove some of the competition from the marketplace, and uh, people who have monopoly power essentially tend to abuse it.
Yeah. No, I mean, really, really interesting conversation so far. I really appreciate all of your thoughts on this subject. Um, I guess,
Sam, if I
yes,
could, there something is burning inside. I got to get it out of me.
please.
Um, I know a lot of people in Silicon Valley, up in the Bay Area, and we have what we call Silicon Beach here in Los Angeles. We have a lot of programmers, and one of the things that doesn't make sense to people in the tech community is that we allow students to come in from India, China, Russia, Ukraine, wherever they come from, and they're often brilliant programmers, and they want to stay in America after they graduate. But because of these immigration laws, we require them to go back home. So instead of staying here in America and starting companies, a lot of these people love the entrepreneurial spirit of America that doesn't exist back in their home countries. Well, we send them home. And so what do? They start companies there and strengthen somebody else's economy rather than ours. I think we really ought to look at this.
Hmm.
H-1B
Yeah.
visas. Eric already said it. H-1B.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, if we're so focused on these other issues that draw a lot of rhetorical fire and national attention, I mean, these just kind of basic, almost, dare I say, commonsensical changes to certain elements of immigration policy just fly under the radar. I mean, Eric, do you have any thoughts on this on this issue Jeff is bringing up? And is it like something that to your awareness is just an easy fix, and the current policy is just doesn't make any sense? Are there things that we maybe are neglecting, unintended consequences changes could have? I mean, just any knowledge you have on this subject, I'm interested here.
Sure. So I think, this kind of goes into arguments within the right that I find absolutely fascinating. So I think there's a string of, people who are further to the right than myself who are coming at this issue more from a cultural perspective. They're saying America has a particular culture. And if we continue to bring in these people that don't necessarily respect our culture, or just have differing views on things. When cultures clash, you can look across history. It tends to be people tend to push back, and people tend to, feel uncomfortable with that. Now we can get into the moral views on that, but that's just the fact. When you bring cultures together, they tend to clash. And I think this results in a typical reactionary kind of, knee kick from a lot of conservatives that say no immigrants, none. We want to preserve our culture here, And sometimes that gets caught up, I think, in some white nationalism. But I also think there are some people that generally, it's not about the color of your skin. It's about if you can come here from whatever country and you're willing to adopt our ethics. And obviously that doesn't mean religion in any specific sense. I think it means, like Jeff said, that entrepreneurial spirit, that commitment to kind of American idealism, that has made our country, invincible in a lot of ways, at least in the past. So, I think it just depends on the person that we're bringing in. I I am all for bringing the talent from all across the world into this country. I think that has made us stronger in the past. Someone who catches a lot of ire from, I think, both sides at this point, Elon Musk, is a perfect example of this. He was born in South Africa, and he came here because we are the land of opportunity. So there's no reason we need to shutter our doors to those people. But I do think, if you have this is kind of coming into the land of like student visas, right? Because the argument from Secretary of State Rubio is that a lot of these people support what we here in America consider to be terrorist groups. So, but those people could also be extremely intelligent and have a lot of skills. So I think there's a fine line, and of course, I don't mean to say that as if that suggests that's a plurality, or majority, or even plurality. But I think those two things tend to clash within my own side. Kind of the cultural aspects and what they can add to the economy, which tends to be put on the back burner, although I think it is very important if you're willing to contribute.
Mhm. Yeah. I'm curious, Eric, if I could ask a follow-up there. Because you mention a segment of the right has this very cultural perspective, and is worried about, I guess, structural tenability, the soundness, even the purity of kind of maintaining their view of American culture. Now, personally, this is a perspective that I don't really understand. I mean, I guess I can understand it from an observational point of view, but it's not something that I've personally internalized to much any degree I'm aware of. I mean, I just look at American culture as we have it right now, and I see something that's already extremely difficult to categorize, extremely diverse, very, very different depending on what state you're in, whether you're in an urban or rural area. I just don't have much of a robust conception of on the ground, tangibly, what it means to have kind of American culture and how that's different from the cultural conceptions that people coming from other countries have. So if maybe you could elaborate on that a little more, even if it's not a perspective that you adopt yourself, just what are people on the right or this area of the right thinking in terms of here's American culture and here are tangible examples of how it is different from what immigrants, people on student visas, and so forth are bringing into the country. Just maybe if you can help me to understand what's going through people's heads there.
Sure. So I think Americans have this kind of beautiful idealized image that because our Constitution and our Bill of Rights says that we have rights, that we actually do. And we can get into where rights come from, but I don't think that's a given in all places all over the world. And I think in a lot of places from all over the world, you see a lot of misogyny, you see a lot of women's rights being constrained, and you just see different cultural practices that we here in America would consider a violation of human rights. Now we can go country by country, and I think there are a lot of amazing things that make American culture that kind of overarching culture. But you're right; it's more of a weak veil. It's not exactly that there is this one dominant culture and that kind of supersedes every individual place in America. For example, in Louisiana, our culture is very unique, and we're very proud of that. So maybe this answer here is looking again towards federalism. You know, if Louisiana wants to preserve their culture through whether it be immigration laws or whether it be workforce laws, allow them to do that. And the same with California. If you don't really see that there is a specific culture that is different from the people that you're bringing in, or something that you don't see how it would not be preserved or be threatened by bringing in people, then I think you should be allowed to do that. But I think we can kind of get lost in translation when we're talking about people that just have far different expectations of life. They have a different idea of human rights, And I think we need to be careful when we talk about these things. But I think there is really a difference between the way people in other cultures view the world and how people, specifically in the West, but America to even a more specified kind of way.
Hmm. This is a fascinating subject because it seems that what you're saying is that both sides, if we can oversimplify and classify things as sort of two sides here in America, left and the right, are rooted on this issue in a commitment to human rights, right? We want to preserve human rights. And maybe we have even fairly similar, in some instances, conceptions of what human rights are, especially on elements of women's rights and so forth. But we almost then take that commitment and look at different aspects of the problem. While people on the left say you are violating human rights if you treat these people from other cultures differently, and sort of discriminate against them and so forth. People on the right seem to look at the same situation and say, no, a lot of these people, because of their cultural outlook, will lead to further human rights, abuses or differing expectations on human rights here in America, and that itself is a problem for human rights. And we can get into the empirics on whether the conservative view relies on a lot of stereotypes of people that are unfounded, or whether that's not actually the case. Maybe there's some important harsh realities we have to recognize in terms of cultural differences. That's a whole nother discussion. But I just think this is very, very interesting because from a set of relatively common or consistent values, we seem to have completely different policy recommendations and even accuse one another of violating those common values because we're looking at, I guess, different segments of this overall issue. Jeff, do you have any thoughts on any of this?
I do. Now I'm going to sound like an old conservative geezer here. Um,
Please.
I Older people in America, I think, are having a hard time understanding what's going on college campuses these days, especially with respect to this whole Hamas versus Israel thing. We grew up in a time and place when Israel was always, considered the good guys, and people who came from other Middle Eastern countries were considered the terrorists, if you will, based on the sort of post 9/11 thinking. And I find it offensive that we invite over students from other countries from the Middle East, and then they choose to rise up on our college campuses and stir up trouble and protests against Jews and against the Israeli cause. This last big assault on October 7th, that was promulgated by Hamas. It wasn't Israel that started that. And so why Israel has been turned into the bad guy on campuses, old people don't understand. But I think if people come here from other countries, it's like inviting a guest into your home, while they're in your home and you're feeding them and enjoying the conversation, they should be respectful. It's not a time or place to, start a big argument. And I think I think a lot of older people in America would agree with me on this, that if we're sending these people back, it's probably not such a bad thing.
Hmm. Yeah. So Jeff, I'm hesitant to get too far into the Israel-Palestine issue, not because I want to shy away from a difficult conversation, but just because I think it's a very, very complex issue that itself
Yeah.
warrants an entire podcast.
Okay.
If I could maybe just briefly summarize, just for the sake of kind of illustrating to a limited degree the other perspective here, kind of what's going through a lot of young people's minds with respect to Israel and Palestine. I think that the idea is that even if Israel didn't initiate the October 7th attacks, which I think we can all recognize or should all be able to recognize were, utterly abhorrent. They did engage in a lot of policies, resettlement policies, policies of discrimination against the Palestinian people that go a lot further back than what we're seeing in just this recent conflict. I think that that's kind of the root of the issue, the sense that Israel has been engaging in a lot of discriminatory practices, and also a sense that Israel's military response has been disproportionate and not motivated by a clear military objective that's actually tangible and achievable. So I'd love to get more into that issue, and maybe we can invite some people who are experts in this subject to really allow us to grapple with some of those details. But I think that is just an oversimplified presentation of where a lot of young people are coming from here.
All right, let's stick with immigration.
Yeah, yeah. Um, so
Now, can I keep? I'm going to sound like a geezer some more here.
no
I've
problem, please.
I've got some very conservative friends, and when I go to their homes, they always have Fox News in the background playing. And during the Biden administration, I mean, almost every night on Fox News, they had footage of people pouring across the border. They were lifting up the fence, or cutting through the fence, or jumping over the fence. They were just coming in, and the authorities were just kind of hopeless and helpless. They just didn't know what to do, and so they tended to just stand back and watch the people stream by them. Well, this really freaked out my conservative friends. They just couldn't believe that we would allow this border to be so open and porous. And my liberal friends said the solution to all this is to hire a lot more lawyers and judges so we can process them faster. And then I'm not sure if this is true or not, but I'm told that we were giving these incoming people who are crossing the border a cell phone and a prepaid debit card so they could actually spend money. I mean, that seems crazy to me. It's like you're inviting these people in, and I was trying to figure out what could motivate this as a policy. And a lot of my Republican friends say, well, it's obvious. The Democrats want all of these people to come to America because eventually the Democrats are going to figure out how to turn these people into citizens or even fake voters, and it's going to help the Democratic cause, and that's why we need to shut it down. I think we have to have some control over our border. It's just it was way out of control. Maybe now it's too under control, but it wasn't right, and I think it helps explain why Trump won. A lot of my liberal friends can't understand why a majority of Americans voted for Trump, but I think the immigration issue was a huge part of it.
Hmm. If I could jump in here and just ask a question to both of you. We've talked a lot about how Biden's kind of just open border policy or whatever exactly the crisis on the southern border was just kind of atrocious and almost like just intuitively so. But I'm curious, in your view and to your knowledge, what were the tangible effects of something like this? Like, did crime rates go up substantially after we had this flood of people, in from the southern border? Did we have a major economic upturn? Like, what actually happened that harmed Americans here? Or is it just simply the image of people crossing through in a very disorderly, unvetted fashion and the uncertainty surrounding that? That's enough for you to look at that and say, this is a problem.
Yeah, I have an answer to that. So I'm sure you both remember the eating dogs and cats moment from the debate with Trump and Harris. But that specific town that he was talking about, I believe, had a population under 100,000 and received 20,000 immigrants that they were just asked to assimilate. That is the answer. And if you were to go around to border towns and talk to them, they could have an answer to your question. And so I think the effects are real. And like I said at the beginning of the podcast, this is something that people on the coast tend to talk about, and people like us.
Hmm.
And I think that's a good thing. That discussion obviously is necessary. Should never be discouraged from any particular place. But I think some of these real effects can certainly get lost.
Hmm.
And I would venture to say, you know, uh, area by area, people that have taken in some of these migrants have seen a bump in crime. Although I'm saying that offhand, I don't have statistics in front of me, so do with that what you will.
Well, even in blue states and blue cities run by mayors of New York, Chicago, etc., at some point they all said, "Whoa, enough is enough. We can't absorb all these people." It's not just the crime; it's the cost of schooling and healthcare and
Hmm.
everything else, and it's a financial drain on any municipality. So I think these are legitimate issues.
Hmm. Yeah.
Agreed.
No, thank
And
you
by
for
the
that.
way,
I mean, that just,
we've
I
got
feel
to
like, sometimes when we have these conversations, when we talk about something like this, a lot of those obvious problems can kind of go under the radar a little bit and might not be just kind of picked up by everyone. And so we can be talking about an issue like this while someone else is just in the dark of, okay, well, why is this really a problem? So I thank you for kind of helping me to see that more.
And I'd
We're
like to
we're
add
running out
one
of
more.
time here, but are there any other kind of closing thoughts that we want to get into?
Yeah, I just want to say I forgot to mention this before. I do think our media plays a role in all this because I mentioned that at my conservative friend's house, they're playing Fox News all the time, and you get in those days you got to see all the immigrants pouring across the border every day. In a liberal household, it's just the opposite. When you watch MSNBC or CNN, you didn't see any coverage of the immigrant issue. It was like it didn't even exist. Similarly, on conservative media, they were obsessed with Hunter Biden and his laptop. If you look at liberal media, it's not even mentioned. So, as my friend Ruben Navarrete says, a lot of America thinks with only half of its brain. The conservative people get one point of view and the liberal people get another point of view, but not very few people seem to be getting the entire point of view, or at least looking at the same issue from different angles. And I think that's one of the reasons our national conversation exists, is to try to make sure all sides get explored so that
Mm,
people can at least be aware of what's going on. I think a lot of people are only aware of half the issue now.
yeah. No, absolutely, Jeff. And you because of that, you get into this weird circumstance where, someone looks at all the political media they're viewing, and it's just, okay, this is so obvious, this is everywhere. Thus, the people on the other side who are saying something completely different are just idiots, and I have no reason to engage with them. It's like they're just not acknowledging basic realities. They live in some fantasy world somewhere, and so that precludes you from the responsibility of having to engage in these conversations when really you're facing the same problem yourself. You're having this one-sided conception of reality when the issues are oftentimes a lot more nuanced. It creates a very unfortunate situation.
Well, I'll tell you what I don't like. I consider myself pretty moderate. And so when I'm with my liberal friends, I'm trying to explain to them where the conservatives are coming from.
Mhm.
They don't want to hear it. They get mad at me because I'm the
Yeah,
messenger here. I'm trying to tell them what conservatives are thinking. And then the same thing in reverse. I'll tell the conservatives what the liberals are thinking. They don't want to hear it, and they get mad
yeah.
at me. So I'm getting beaten up from both sides here. So that to me says I'm doing something right.
There you go. Good way to look at it. Yeah. Any other closing thoughts from you, Eric, or do you feel like we've covered as much as we can here?
Yeah, I think this was a productive conversation. I think this is, like Jeff highlighted, this is a very good example of how kind of, the modern media layout doesn't do anyone favors when you're actually trying to learn about multiple perspectives of a given issue. So I think conversations like these, especially at ONC, are absolutely essential.
Mhm. Well, I appreciate both of you for coming on and having this conversation, sort of explaining things to broaden my perspective. And can't wait to talk with you in the future. But we're gonna have to end the episode there. So thank you again.
This podcast was brought to you by Our National Conversation, a place where students generate policy solutions to the biggest problems facing America. Join us in freeing political dialogue from hyperpartisanship. To learn more about what you heard today, check us out at ournationalconversation.org. You can also follow us on social media at Our National Conversation to show your support and keep up with our latest efforts.